Dr. Nardi here, and in this video we're going to talk about memory. We're going to start off our conversation with talking about why do we forget? Now, the process of forgetting has been studied for as long as there's been the field of experimental psychology. Now, forgetting is a natural process that occurs when information is unable to be retrieved from memory. This inability to retrieve information is generally seems to increase as the time since the information learned increases. Ebbinghaus in 1885 first showed that forgetting follows a typical pattern where a lot of information is forgotten, very quickly after the study, but the rate of loss slows as the length of the time since the study increases. This pattern of forgetting has held up over many studies and since the time of Ebbinghaus's first experiments. Early in the study of memory, researchers suggested that memories simply decay over time, like, for example, the way the colors in a printed photograph fade over time. However, this idea does not describe the mechanisms by which information is lost from memory, and its popularity as a cause of forgetting has decreased over the decades, at least with memory researchers. Now, one mechanism of forgetting does seem to be interference. Interference occurs when other information prevents the retrieval of the target information. Now, another process that has been proposed for forgetting is the lack of consolidation. Now, consolidation is a neural process by which memories are strengthened and more permanently stored in the brain. Now, initially, memory storage relies on brain structures called the hippocampus, but we've known that how important this is to memories. However, the hippocampus is not the only place where memories are stored. They're also stored in other cortical areas of the brain. Again, that allows for more permanent storage. Now, the other thing that might be important when it comes to forgetting is consolidation that happens when you sleep. Now, as you sleep, your neurological connections are strengthened. However, research has shown that people who don't sleep enough have some memory issues. Now, one of the main processes of memory is, well, we could break it down into three processes, which is encoding, storage, and retrieval. Now, encoding and retrieval are the processes most under our control, and therefore these processes can be conducted in ways that help us remember information better. We'll first start talking about the encoding process, basically how we process information coming into our memory systems. And I'll also talk about encoding techniques that aid us in the retrieval from long-term memory. Now, a general rule is that the more active and effortful the encoding processes are, the better we remember. But the question is, how do we make these processes more active and effortful? Now, if we look back in history a little bit, in the 1970s, researchers discovered something interesting about memory performance. The deeper the information was encoded, the better it was remembered. And they looked at different levels of processing. They talked about shallow processing. Now, that's encoding information according to its surface features. Then they talked about deep processing. That's encoding information according to its meaning. And they really got into the levels of processing effect. And this is known as, basically, it's an effect showing better memory for information encoded with deep processing rather than shallow processing. So if you can really encode information by its meaning instead of a shallow feature, you'll remember the information better. Other researchers looked at what we call spacing effects. Now, when you have a big exam coming up, how do you study for it? Do you study for a couple hours each day for several days before the exam, or do you study all day the day before the exam? Now, you might be surprised to know that research has shown that the first study plan often results in better memory than the second study plan. This is called the spacing effect. This results holds even when the total amount of study time is equivalent across the 2 study plans. Basically, in other words, studying for 1 hour every day for a week before an exam should result in better memory for the material than studying, for 7 hours the day before. If you do, 1 week, an hour a day, that's 7 hours. So remember, when you take an exam, space out the studying. Do not try to cram the night or day before. The other thing to note about memory is the serial position effect. Now, memory researchers have shown that the first information encoded and the last information encoded tends to be remembered better than information in the middle. This has generally been shown in encoding lists of items, like lists of words. For example, words studied at the start of a list and words studied at the end of a list are the ones most likely to be retrieved from memory. When the first information encoded, it shows more memory advantages. This is known as the primacy effect. When the last information encoded shows more advantages, this is called the recency effect. Now we can kind of look at this in what we call a serial position curve. This is an effect in memory showing the best memory for information encoded at the beginning and the end of a session. The other thing I want to talk about briefly is the testing effect. Now, I have a question. Do you read your notes over? So, do you reread the assigned readings? Do you highlight important concepts in the textbook or your notes? I would say, you know what a better effective strategy is? Take practice quizzes. In your text or in the online learning environment, if you're online or if you're in person, find practice quizzes. Now, if you're like most students, you probably just reread your notes and the text that you highlight. However, I'm going to tell you all, recent research has shown that taking the practice quizzes is the most effective way to improve later retrieval because it provides retrieval practice. This effect is known as the testing effect. Reviewing information by means of an intervening test aids later retrieval. So again, the testing effect in memory, basically showing better memory for information that has been tested in the retention interval as compared with the encoding of the information. So again, take practice tests. It'll help you do better on your exams and quizzes. Now, we could talk about the encoding-retrieval interaction. Now, the interaction between encoding and retrieval processes has been a topic of numerous research studies in memory in the recent decades. Based on the results of these studies, it is clear that matching the circumstances of the encoding and retrieval aids in memory. Now, this phenomenon is known as the encoding specificity principle. These circumstances can improve the stimuli in the environment, one's mood, thoughts about the information, and the physiological state and the processing type. So here's a couple things we're going to consider with the environment, the mood, and the processing effect. First, research suggests that a match in the environment between your study location and your testing location will provide the best condition for memory retrieval. If you're not tested with music, for example, playing, then you should not study with music playing. If you're tested in a large, quiet room, then you should study in a large, quiet room. Now, in fact, studying in your classroom or, in your online learning space, like your bedroom, is the best chance for you to do best on the exam, because that's where you first learn the material. So your goal here is to match the environment between the study and test. This can aid you in memory. But the other thing you have to figure out is you want to match your mood between your study and test. Numerous research support this idea. So you want to make sure, you're in a good mood when you take your test, if you can, and in a good mood when you study. Similar effects basically can also talk about a match in the type of processing between the study and test can also aid in memory. This match in processing is called transfer appropriate processing and seems to have stronger effects on memory than the environment or mood dependent effects. In other words, unlike the depth of processing effects where encoding is only influencing factor on memory performance, in transfer appropriate processing effects, both encoding and retrieval together to influence memory processes or memory performance. The other technique that people often use is mnemonics, and these are memory techniques that have been used by humans for thousands of years to remember information. They rely on mechanisms of long-term memory to store information in a way that is more memorable, like please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. That's a very famous one. Or every good boy does fine. That's for the musical notes. Roy G. Bibb is for the colors. Again, you probably have a bunch, and if you're on my YouTube channel, leave a comment below and I'll take a look there. Now, the other thing I want to talk about very briefly, more recent research has looked at basically what we call photographic memory. Now, this type of memory is where people claim they can just picture in their mind specific episodes or information. Now, researchers have yet to find a clear scientific evidence for this form of memory. However, some recent studies suggest that for every few individuals, a type of superior autobiographical memory may exist. Now, autobiographical memories are memories of your day-to-day life, right? For example, what you had for breakfast in the morning, or the day you broke up with your last girlfriend or boyfriend. Now, there have been some studies, like the case of AJ. AJ could remember with near perfect accuracy the events from her life and the historical events when given a date chosen by the researchers, I should say. They verified her personal statements from diaries she kept spanning 24 years of her life. And basically, they since have verified 10 others with the same superior autobiographical memory. Now, unfortunately, I do not have that, and maybe some of you do, maybe some of you don't, but it seems to be potentially quite rare. With that said, thank you for watching the video. Like, subscribe, and share. Hit that like button, leave a comment down below, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.